I'd like to welcome everyone here tonight. Tonight's lecturer, Dr. Chen-Ning Yang, comes from the State University of New York at Stony Brook, where he is presently Albert Einstein Professor of Physics, and also Director of the Institute of Theoretical Physics there. Dr. Yang is a member of the Board of Directors of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and he is on the Board of Trustees of the Salk Institute. In 1957, Dr. Yang received the Albert Einstein Commemorative Award and the Nobel Prize for Physics. Dr. Yang became president of the National Association of Chinese Americans in 1977. I'd like to take time to say that tomorrow there will be a lecture between two friends, Paul Sweezy and John Gurley of Stanford University, about China's economic situation and its socialism. The topic of tonight's lecture is Science in the People's Republic of China. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Chen-Ning Yang.
On October the 1st, 1949, in declaring the establishment of the People's Republic of China, Chairman Mao said that the Chinese people have stood up. That was a historical statement which spoke to the heart of all the Chinese peoples. To appreciate the significance of that, we have to go a little bit into the history of China. So allow me to do that. We all know that China had a glorious ancient civilization and had contributed to the world advanced technology, advanced methods of manufacturing in early times. If you look into the history of the world, you would find that silk and China well manufacturing were very important products of China, which was eagerly sought after in the other parts of the world. There was the story that at one time the Roman emperor declared that if the Roman ladies do not stop buying silk from China, it would bankrupt the whole Roman Empire. If you read Joseph Needham's books on science and technology in China in ancient times, you would find that in the Ming Dynasty, China evidently led the world in, for example, the construction of seagoing ships. If you have the occasion to visit Zhaozhou in Hebei, you will find a beautiful bridge, which is the oldest bridge constructed, which is still being used in the world today. I had the good fortune to visit Guanxian in Sichuan in 1978 and found to my great amazement the hydraulic works there constructed over 2,000 years ago, which is still used today. It has been enlarged, of course, but the fundamental ideas were the same as that constructed under Mr. Li Bin over 2,000 years ago. And yet, with all of these technological inventions, with all her industrious and intelligent people, China has fallen in the 18th and 19th century very much backwards as compared with the industrializing and industrialized countries. 300 years of a corrupt imperial government in Peking, which oftentimes practiced fascist policies within China herself, has brought China to one of the lowest periods in her proud history. Coupled with this, the Western industrialized countries shamelessly exploited China's weakness and was practicing the art of carving China up into spheres of influence to benefit themselves. In 1911, Dr. Sun Yat-sen led a revolution which overthrew the Manchu imperial court. However, the subsequent 40 years of history in China was as turbulent and as difficult for the Chinese people as it had ever been. When Mao declared that the Chinese people have stood up in terms of scientific and technological development, China was in fact extremely backwards. I need only give you one example. Shanghai was and still is the industrial capital of China. In 1949, after the Chinese Communist government took over, a small diesel engine repair shop worried very much about what the new government expected them to do. I had the story told me by themselves because that diesel engine factory is now a very big one in Shanghai. When I visited it in 1971, they told me that after worrying for a number of weeks, they finally received a visit from a government official from the new Shanghai government in 1949. And they were told that all that was expected of them was that they should do what they could to contribute to the construction of the new China. So they got together and designed a diesel engine, something that they'd never done before. Because although Shanghai was the industrial capital of China, there was no knowledge of manufacturing of diesel engines before 1949 in China. All that they were doing were repair work. So they got together and designed a diesel engine, and after a few months, when it went into production, they had a big celebration. That diesel engine had a horsepower of 3 horsepowers. When I visited in 1971, they showed me a 10,000 horsepower diesel engine. I need not give you other examples, but it is literally true that in 1949, China did not know how to make a needle or how to make a match. It was a very difficult task for the new government to build upon such a weak foundation scientific and technological know-how, expertise, and equipment. A series of measures were adopted, starting with, in the early 50s, a reorganization of the then Chinese higher educational system. This was called 院系调整, reorganization of colleges and departments. Also established during that time was the Academy of Sciences, and these measures served to train new scientific and technological people for China, and also to establish centers of research. In 1956, a national conference on science was held, and a 12-year plan of scientific and technological development was adopted. In retrospect, it is clear that although the goals, not every goal of that 12-year plan was met, the total success of that 12-year plan is not to be denied. An enormous number of scientists were trained, an enormous number of new disciplines were gotten into, the industrial production capabilities in various fields, the varieties of industrial products greatly increased. Many scientific journals publishing original research were put out, and there were also a number of very important research results. Of these, the most famous and perhaps the most important was the 1965-66 successful synthesis of the human and the bovine insulin. It was a first among many competitors all over the world. I had the occasion to talk to the workers, the scientific workers of the Shanghai Biochemistry Institute of the Academy of Sciences, and I learned that when they embarked on the project in the late 50s, China did not know how to make any of the enzymes. It was therefore a super difficult effort. To synthesize insulin, which is a very complicated protein by the standards of those days, was a very difficult process for any country. But for a country like China, which had no technology or know-how about making the enzymes, it was an impossible task. But with the collaborative effort of 3 institutions and universities, they worked very hard, and as I said, they did achieve a world first. I would therefore say that the period before 1966, from 1949, that 17 years, judged from a historical viewpoint, marked great strides in Chinese scientific and technological development. Then came 1966 and the Great Cultural Revolution. It is only in the last 2 or 3 years that the damage that was done to Chinese research efforts, to Chinese higher education, was completely or partially revealed to the people of China and to the peoples of the world. I need only give you one example. I visited in 1977 the Harbin Industrial Institute and learned to my amazement that in the late 60s, under a directive from Lin Biao, the university was asked to move to Chongqing. Now, to move a university is a very complicated business, but since the directive was there, they had to do it. And they had no place really in Chongqing to move to that was ready for them. But they did move most of the people and most of their equipment in crates to Chongqing. However, the conditions for Chongqing was very difficult, so therefore much of the equipment that was moved in Chongqing was left rotting in the elements, and that of course caused great damage to the university. Such kind of phenomena was not just the case with the single university, but has occurred to many institutes. Those institutes that were not moved suffered greatly due to various interference with their academic work. I must say that these were not clear to me during my visits up to 1976, and much of these were revealed only after that. Among the fields closer to myself, namely various disciplines within physics, I learned in the last 2 years that such areas like solid-state experiment and theory suffered in some sense more than my specialty, which is high-energy theory. The reason for this was not clear to me at the beginning, but now I eventually understood. Solid-state physics, of course, does have a practical component. And during the Cultural Revolution, under the wrong concept, very leftist concept by some of the leaders in China, the people in solid-state theory were pushed into doing the more practical type of things in solid-state physics. The people in solid-state experiments were also pushed to do the more practical kinds of solid-state experiments. Since high-energy physics has no practical parts to it, therefore they suffered less. Very fortunately for the Chinese people and for the Chinese scientists and educators, October 1976 brought a new era. That was the time when the Gang of Four were arrested, and a new chapter is begun in the People's Republic of China. The problems which derived from the great disturbances during the Cultural Revolution, however, cannot be solved overnight. Therefore, first, there was something like a year's effort devoted to essentially political readjustment. That included the bringing out from obscurity the current Vice Premier, Deng Xiaoping, who has always emphasized that science and technology must, for the good of the Chinese people, be given great priority. Then things began to move faster, and in March 1978, an enormously large national science conference was held in Peking with 6,000 people attending from all over China. This was followed by a national education conference, and at these conferences and at a number of national political meetings, a number of resolutions or determinations were adopted, and an 8-year scientific and technological development plan was adopted. It was planned that up to 1985, China will train 800,000 scientists and engineers. 108 items, specific items of scientific areas were singled out for development. Of these, 27 were given higher priority. These 27 spheres included agriculture, resources, medicine, etc., But of these 27, 8 are singled out for the highest priority. These included agriculture, energy resources, material resources, computers, laser developments, space physics, high energy physics, and genetic engineering. They were also decided that 120 large industrial developmental projects will be carried out in 8 years. In order to administer the scientific and technological developments, the Science and Technology Commission of China was re-established. The Science and Technology Commission of China was in existence before the Cultural Revolution, and was a kind of a NSF, DOE research part, and perhaps the DOD public research part all rolled into one. It was re-established, and Vice Premier Fang Yi was put in charge. I had previously referred to the fact that China established in the 50s an Academy of Sciences. The Academy of Sciences system in China is copied after that of the United States, and is a very different organization from the United States National Academy of Sciences, which is variously referred to as a paper organization or an empty honorific title. Whatever it is, the National Academy of Sciences in the United States does not do any research. But the Soviet Academy of Sciences is the main scientific research arm of the Soviet people. And that is the system adopted by China. And I see every indication that China will stay with the system. Before the Cultural Revolution, there were over 100 different institutes within the Academy of Sciences. Not all of them were equally good, but they were in general the pioneering arms of the Chinese scientific establishment. During the Cultural Revolution, these institutes were either shrunk or disbanded, so that in the end, something like 20 remained. In the last 3 years, that number has been restored to over 100. And one particular institute, the Institute of Social Sciences, was separated out, and it became a separate academy, now called the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. As of last October, that academy had by itself 18 different research institutes. The universities were also reorganized. While I had emphasized that the academy institutes were the main organizations for doing research work in China, that does not mean that Chinese universities did not carry out research. Indeed, a number of the more important Chinese universities also carried on important research. And a year and a half ago, first 26 universities were designated as the key universities. Later on, that number has been increased to 88. So that 88 universities are now regarded as the research and graduate education centers of Chinese higher education. During the Cultural Revolution, they were established many July 21st workers' universities. That was necessary because besides training elite scientists and engineers in the universities, China recognized that there must be large numbers of technical people trained in less elitist-oriented, less research-oriented institutes. The July 21st Workers' University has been judged to be of importance to China, and therefore it is not unlike some of the institutions established during the Cultural Revolution time, is not now disbanded. In fact, it is expanded. Starting from the first 2 months of 1978, 3 classes of students have been admitted into Chinese universities, each numbering somewhere between 250,000 to 300,000. The aim of China is to increase this enrollment as rapidly as possible. The reason that these numbers are not increased faster, the total number of intake every year is not increasing as fast as one might expect, is due to a very simple reason. There's not enough housing on the campuses. The houses, very few new houses or new buildings have been built during the Cultural Revolution time. And furthermore, some of the older buildings have been taken over for various other functions. For example, during the Cultural Revolution time, all universities established some factories on their campuses. Most of these factories have now been judged to be wasteful and not really useful for either educational purposes or for production purposes. But there are factories which are judged to be useful, and they remain, and they therefore occupied some of the old buildings. It is my understanding that the limitation at this moment, the most strict limitation, the bottleneck among the universities so that they cannot take in more students is due to lack of housing. And there is every effort made, as far as I understand, of a fast increase of new buildings on all campuses. In 1978, 60,000 students took examinations to become graduate students. The total number that were taken were a few thousand. Current plans are that very rapidly, the total number of graduate students in China will increase to 10,000. When I was in China in the summer of 1978, there was fever in all the cities because of the fact that there's a renewed emphasis on tests. Everybody was talking about the mathematics test which was held in many provinces and cities in China. And everywhere I went, it seemed that everybody knew who was number 1, who was number 2, who was number 3 in this test. There was a special class of gifted students none of whom was older than 15 in age, who passed some special examinations and were assembled together in Hefei, in Anhui province. And these gifted students were given special accelerated courses. And a second class was admitted. Now, altogether, the total number of these gifted students which are being trained is of the order of 130. I believe the experience of training these gifted students is a very interesting one, and I was told that it is not as simple as it appeared at first. These gifted students are particularly young, and they present special problems, and they also present very different problems because of the great variation of ages and of interests. Whether this gifted student idea will be pursued and what would be the final evaluation of the success or failure of this effort remains to be seen. But this is another of those examples of how China tries to make up for the lost time by trying to reach into very young and gifted new people. China is making a major effort to establish new centers of scientific research in new places. For example, Hefei, where the Science and Technology University is designated as a place where China is about to build a new science center, comprising of a new campus for the Science and Technology University, one of the most prestigious universities in China, and also 4 or 5 new research institutes of the Academy of Sciences. Chengdu is another town which has been designated as the site of a new science center. In May 1978, when Frank Press went to China, he discussed with the Chinese leaders about the possibility of having exchange students between the two countries. He was amazed that the Chinese leaders agreed instantly. You must remember that was before diplomatic normalization has taken place. It is my understanding that he went there fully expecting that China would say no before normalization of diplomatic relations. President Chou Pei-yuan of Peking University came a year ago in October to finalize these negotiations, and as a consequence of that, word 2,300. Of this 500 to 600 scholars and students in this country, the overwhelming majority are people at the research associate level, people between the ages of, let us say, 35 to 40. It is my understanding that the largest concentration at the moment is at the University of Wisconsin, which has some 60 Chinese scholars and graduate students. Berkeley, MIT, Stony Brook, each has something of the order of 20 to 30. The others are going to various places. For example, when Minnesota heard that Wisconsin is going to get that many Chinese students, they immediately sent a delegation to China. I think there are now more than 10 Chinese scholars on the campus of Minnesota. It is my understanding that during the next 6 months, the number of Chinese scholars and students would enormously again increase over the existing 500 to 600. China recognizes that while scientific research is an important component of scientific development, popularization of science is also important. In fact, China very much is aware of the fact that scientific development must be supported by the general population, and that can only be done if the general population has some understanding of the directions and the importance of modern science. So popular science publications proliferate in China today. If you go to a Chinese bookstore today, you would find all kinds of journals and magazines telling about science, starting from rather complicated levels down to science books for children. I am enormously pleased that one of the suggestions that I made in 1973 has borne fruit. I was asked by Premier Zhou Enlai and Chairman Mao Zedong in 1973 when I saw them, what measures could China take to promote science? I said one of the things that I could think about is a issue-by-issue translation of the Scientific American, a journal which is very prestigious, which I've always enjoyed reading, which I've always profited from by reading, and which I know many university students and graduate students and faculty members in this country very much like to read. Starting from 1974, a translation of this of the Scientific American did appear. However, the translation was rather slow. It lagged behind by about 15 months. And furthermore, the reproductions of the pictures, which are oftentimes very beautiful, left much to be desired. Gerard Peel, the publisher of Scientific American, was in China last summer, and he saw Vice Premier Fang Yi, who is also the head of the Academy of Sciences. And he offered to speed up the Chinese publication and to improve the quality of the reproduction by flying over the plates before they are published in this country. China eagerly agreed to this arrangement. As a consequence, the first speeded up, more beautiful translation will come out in January 1980, and there will be only a lag of 4 months. Incidentally, I should mention that he negotiated with China to sell advertisement for the Scientific American at $10,000 per page, which will be split, if I understand correctly, 50-50 between the Scientific American and China. And when I saw him about 3 weeks ago, he said he had so many advertisements he didn't know what to do with them. Popularization of science does not just end in publications. There are lectures organized in the big cities to explain science to the layman, to the high school students, to elementary school students. Also, a number of government agencies organized special seminars where they invite university and research people to tell them what science is all about. I had previously mentioned that high energy physics, the field in which I do my research work is one of the emphasized areas in the Chinese scientific development. Indeed, China decided at the end of 1977 that China will build a new national high-energy research laboratory in the Mintom area, some 2 hours drive north of Peking. China will build a 50 billion electron volt accelerator, and when finished, it will be the 4th largest in the world. It was a very large undertaking, especially since China did not have any experience in building any high-energy accelerators. The original goal was more ambitious than what I just stated, because the energy was set at 50 billion, but the completion date was set for 1982. Early this year, in 1979, for various reasons, it became clear that the estimate that China made in the progress of all the large projects has been overly ambitious. And as a consequence, there was a readjustment or retrenchment, and many projects were postponed. Included in this was the high-energy physics accelerator. The postponement did not mean that the project stopped. It only meant that the completion date was extended by 2 years to the end of 1984. For this reason, this year, there are a large number of Chinese high-energy physicists, both theoretical, experimental, and accelerator design people, visiting various United States laboratories. And the United States and China has signed separate special agreements about this specific area of collaboration. I remember that when I was a graduate student in China in 1943, I attended a Chinese Physical Society meeting in Kunming. There were about 24 people meeting, and the areas of physics that were covered was very limited. In 1977, I attended the Chinese high-energy physics conference, high-energy theoretical physics conference in Huangshan. The total number of people attending that was about 130. Now, high-energy physics is a very small branch of physics. The contrast could not have been more sharp in my mind. It became clear to me that despite all the great difficulties and turmoils that China suffered, in the 30 years, starting from 1949, China did educate several generations of scientists and did expand into various subdisciplines within physics, so that there were that many people interested in one special discipline. I've been talking to many of the Chinese scientists who come on very short visits during the last 2 years to the United States. I've talked to many of the Chinese scholars who are now resident in this country doing research for a year or two. And my general impression is that there are a number of very able and very capable research workers among the 500 or 600 people who are here. And that the total reservoir of very capable research workers in China is in fact very large. But perhaps more important than this, if we look at the total contribution that each group of people is going to make to the modernization aim of China in the year 2000, then it is very clear that the largest share of this modernization is still to be made by people who are still in their college education period today. And when I talk to the various educators who have come from China during the last year, it is very obvious that among the people who are about to graduate in January 1982, and then again in the summer of 1982, and then every summer after that, there are a number of extremely promising students, and I believe personally, and I think most of the Chinese educators are convinced that out of these crops of Chinese university graduates, there will be very promising scientific workers who perhaps would pull China up to world standards by the year 2000. It is very obvious to me, since I have visited many universities in America in connection with my physics work, sometimes in connection with my so-called expertise about China, that many American universities are very much interested in this communication with China in the scholarly exchange program. I personally think that this is very far-sighted. I happen to know that the thinking in Washington in this respect is very much enlightened. It was reasoned that throughout the 20th century, China has sent many students to be educated in the United States, and many of these students have returned to China. Some of them are now in China, and other of them are in Taiwan. And it is recognized that these people have not only produced important policy decisions in China, but they have influenced long-range Chinese political decisions. It is recognized in Washington that this influence in general, from the viewpoint of America, is beneficial to America. Therefore, the American government welcomed, in fact pushed, for this greater possibility of having Chinese scholars and students here in the United States, not because of any necessarily altruistic feelings, but because of self-interest. Perhaps nothing could speak to this more eloquently than a quotation from Vice President Mondale when he was in China a few months ago. He gave a speech there, and he said, among other things, America deepening its relations with China does so not only out of genuine sentiment and not only out of natural curiosity. It does so out of the same combination of principle and self-interest that is the engine of mature relations among all modern states. I believe that's an enlightened attitude. I believe that is an attitude that will bear important good fruit for both the United States and China, and I wholeheartedly support it. Thank you.
Mr. Yang will take any questions that anyone has.